Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us during this very special weekend of celebrating Vida's 50 years of ministry. My name is Nate Hausman, and I serve as the Director of Outdoor Education for Vida. Over my years, I've had the privilege of meeting many of the key figures who have kept this ministry alive and thriving. I'm so glad you have decided to tune in to watch these videos to hear more about Vida's beginnings in the 70s and how we eventually acquired the base camp. I'll be starting out interviewing Steve Oliver and Tuck Knupp, two of the participants on the very first Vida trip in 1970. Both Steve and Tuck were Young Life staff who spent numerous seasons supporting the work of Vida in the Adirondacks. Stay tuned because after that is my interview with Eric Wilder. Eric was director of Vida's ADK programming in the 90s and was key with finding and purchasing the Adirondack base camp. Enjoy the video, and thanks again for attending our anniversary celebration. So many people, I feel like have been influenced and impacted by the Vida program over the past 50 years. Some of us only know about those early days through stories that we've heard over the years, a lot of those coming from Rich and others who we've been able to interact with. And there's a few individuals out there who can relive those first days of Vida by recalling their own memories. And I'm here with two of those individuals, Steve Oliver and Tuck Knupp, and excited to have them join us. Before we go too far, guys, Steve and Tuck, would love if you guys could take a couple minutes just to introduce yourself and maybe give us a glimpse into how you first heard about Vida and got involved with the program.
Tuck and I have a similar story. We, in 1970, were graduating from college, and basically, I don't know, for Tuck, we're both was pretty close. Within a day or two of finishing college, we were driving up to a new property that Young Life had bought, Saranac Village. There'd been no campers there. We literally had just bought it months before. We had a diverse patrol from all kinds of races. One guy brought his German Shepherd, and it was a wonderful group. And off we went. We're base camp for 2 or 3 days. So we were out for 22 days. The point was we were just going to pick trails in Adirondacks and figure out what worked.
Wow.
In the early days, it was canoeing and hiking. So we went out and did some canoeing, did some hiking, experimented with trails. Lots of great stories, got to know each other, learned as we went. And when we came back 22 days later, Saranac Village was full of high school campers, and just what a difference in what we left.
Wow.
Tuck, fill it in.
Yes, we were getting ready to come on the Young Life staff. Steve and I were both going to be a part of the brand new training program in the Metro Washington, D.C. area. And we were not asked, we were assigned to be on this first Vida program at Saranac. As Steve mentioned, right out of school, we were on our way. I think we were the first people into camp at Saranac. And I doubt that there's ever been another patrol quite like that. One was very large. What would you say, Steve? A little over 20 folks. And some of them were a good bit older too, as I recall, maybe early 30s.
Yeah.
It was quite a potpourri. And you said 22 days. Were we out there that long?
That was my memory. I don't remember the patrol being that big, but you may be right. The memories fade.
One of the things that occurred to me as we were thinking about this is that back in the day, this was 1970, there was not the plethora of outdoor activities available to a lot of young folks. It was before Young Life. It predated ropes courses at Young Life, and there were not these kind of rock climbing walls in every suburb around the country, and kids just didn't have those kind of experiences. I had never had that kind of experience before, not been exposed to anything like this.
Would you say then that you were on the very first trip?
Oh, yeah.
Were you guys considered the staff then who were helping to lead the expedition?
Not this greenhorn.
And how did you two get recruited to go on that trip? I mean, you said that you were assigned, but was there any indicator by you all that, yeah, we wouldn't mind spending some time in the wilderness, or we've got an inkling towards that? Or was it really these guys, they're just starting out, so we'll throw them in the deep end right away.
Basically, I think we were happy to go, but we just got out of college, Young Life's our job, training programs going on, and they said, go up there and do this. So a part of it was that too. There were those that had the vision. Tuck and I were honored to be on the first one. I'd be remiss to say, the 50 years of La Vida, Rich O'Shane was intimately responsible for 45 of those years.
Yeah.
When we were starting, we had no idea they'd be celebrating a 50th anniversary. We loved it. We saw what happened to people's lives, and lives got changed. And it was just a spirit that people kind of came back from, spiritual, personal, just the outdoors can do so much for people.
Yeah.
But the vision and how it got blessed and how it evolved, that was just sovereign grace of God putting it all together, and all those that have given to it. So
yeah,
we were blessed to be at the beginning, but the fact it is where it is was the responsibility and the result of so many more, especially led by Rich.
What was the wilderness like back in 1970? How do you think the Adirondacks compared back then, 50 years ago?
Well, I don't recall seeing a whole lot of people during our time out there. We rappelled on Mount Joe, which is a pretty popular place these days.
Yeah.
We did our canoeing on Long Lake and the Racket River, as I recall.
And we still do that.
And I don't, but let's see, we climbed Haystack, I think. That was our big climb, wasn't it?
Steve? Well, and Marcy, we did Marcy as well.
Did we do Marcy? Marcy's number one, Haystack's number two. I thought, okay.
And I remember canoeing the Upper Hudson as well. I don't know, it doesn't have, we tried it for several years, it doesn't always have water, but that summer it had water. And we did some whitewater canoeing with the brand new 17-foot aluminum Grumman canoes. And I remember one of them got jackknifed on a rock, and so that baby lasted about 2 weeks. But I think you still have some of those canoes around, or at least the last I looked, you did. And that's from the beginning. That's the history of La Vida right there with those canoes.
You mentioned the old Grumman aluminum canoes, because I know we have some with the old Young Life emblem still on the front of the bow, and it's right there. So that's pretty remarkable to think that those could be 50 years old. Can you remember or tell us a little bit of, like, summer concludes 1970, and I'm sure Scott, George, some of Jim, those guys are, who's taking the reins to make sure this thing continues, or what happened to make sure that it got to 1971?
Pete Weaver must have gone on one of the early trips. Pete was an area director in the Pittsburgh area. And by 72, Pete was the director, and I have to give Pete the credit for all the logistics. He really put together a schedule that had four different areas on the trail at one time, 15-day patrols.
Wow.
And we had a remarkably tight kind of logistical schedule.
Huh.
We were operating out of Saranac in the summer. We had a little shack down there in the infield that had all our supplies in it.
Huh.
We slept on the property. The regular campers weren't real thrilled to have us around because we always smelled like fly dope. They always knew when La Vida Patrol came back on the last day because you could smell them a mile away. But Steve and I, by the time we were sharing leadership, 73, 74, I think, we were running it out of our area offices. At the same time, we were full-time area directors. So.
The way it was then was someone became La Vida director. You're still working your Young Life area, but then you're responsible for, and Tuck and I shared this, getting supplies, doing things, getting the food, getting equipment, helping people to sign up, make sure patrols are coming. But the area directors would be bringing their own patrols from it's still pretty new, but you advertise, you spread the word, get people to sign up. And the director was responsible for hiring the staff, just like you'd hire staff for Young Life Camp and staff. And the staffing was typically Sherpas and a mountaineer. And the Sherpas did not go with the patrols in those early days. You would supply and meet. The traveling with the patrols was something happened at some later time.
Huh.
We were supply. We would later on, after I finished, I know Sherpas would sometimes trail along nearby.
And so then it was the actual local Young Life staff who were essentially leading their trip out in the woods.
Yes.
Yep.
Huh. And did they receive any type of training?
Well, I mean, this is the whole deal of the teachable moment. We teach them how to do things. We teach them how to read a map. We teach them how to do some things, etc. And then off they go. And as far as I know, there's no lost patrols wandering through the Adirondacks, with a tribe.
We did some training as we went. One of my fondest memories was the first year that we got the little stoves, the little propane stoves. We'd never had them before. Everybody just collected wood and had to start their fires. And so we gathered this group of leaders in a parking lot, a dirt parking lot out in the park. And Pete Weaver was going to show them how to operate one of these stoves that they were all going to get when they arrived with their patrol. And he lit the thing, and the thing just kind of blew up in a big ball of flame. And Pete jumped back, and then he didn't know what to do. He started kicking it across the parking lot to put out the fire. We didn't instill a whole lot of confidence in those patrol leaders.
I know from Rich, I remember him sharing that everybody would be issued a poncho. Is that right? And the poncho served as rain protection that you could wear, but also they then had to learn how to rig that up on their solo for their solo structure.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, this was the 1970s, and people were getting outdoors and doing things. And for most kids, this was an adventure. This was pushing them.
I don't recall much about how the solo has changed. We did 3 full days on the solo, and it was a fast. There was no food. Are they still doing it that way?
We do. The college students all do a 2-day solo, and they would also have the opportunity to fast if they choose to do so. Probably one of the elements of the trip that we get the most pushback from now. It's just one of those things that people are very uncomfortable thinking about being by themselves, being in the woods by themselves for that long. It's one of the things that people probably come into the experience more afraid and nervous about the solo experience than rappelling or rock climbing or any of that.
Yeah.
But certainly after those 24, 48 hours, it's probably the experience they reflect back upon and say, this was the most influential number of hours on my trip. Yep.
And you have your big celebration now. We would have a celebration dinner at base camp. You finish solo, which is right near base camp.
Yep.
You come to base camp, have your celebration dinner there, and then kind of canoe out, pick up the canoes, and go on your run back to Saranac and your final run, and then turn your gear and whatever. So instead of having all the groups, as you do now, have this big celebration.
Yep.
Each group would have their own and reflect on that night coming, because they're talkative after their solo. It's just a great time to pull together, have a nice meal.
Yeah.
Catch up, reflect on what they learned, not learned.
Yeah.
Do you remember how we broke our solo, Steve?
Tell me, because I'm sure I forgot.
I'm hoping the statute of limitations is passed on this. You got to remember the whole.
Note at the beginning of this conversation that anything that you say during this Zoom call will not be held against you for in the court of law.
And can be edited out.
Now you have to recall we were all post-college and older. So while we were on solo,
all guys.
Yeah.
And all guys?
Oh yes, all guys. That's right.
And one dog.
And one dog.
Wow.
Carlos was the guy's name who had that dog, that German Shepherd. I remember Carlos.
Yeah.
Kuntz and Sheffer went in town while we were on solo. It was 3 days. They didn't want to just hang out at base camp. So they thought it'd be fun. They brought back some hamburger, marshmallows, and beer. And we had been on, we've been fasting for 3 days and having all these food fantasies, and he put some hamburgers in front of us. Well, the last thing you want to do to break a 3-day fast is have a hamburger and a beer and finish it off with a marshmallow. Oh, we were all sick to our stomachs. It was horrible.
That's awesome.
That was Chuck's trip. I don't remember any of that.
It also sounded like the Racket River really became kind of the ending point for many of the trips, right? Folks they would start and hike, and then would they hike over to Long Lake, or would you have to take a vehicle to get there?
We
I feel like,
weren't doing much vehicle stuff. I believe you were hiking there,
and the
and
canoe were kind of
there would
waiting
be
for it.
some portages you would do, whatever rivers we had, and you'd have like a mile or two portage to get over. And then I remember being Long Lake and people using their ponchos and trying to set up sails and, well, it's just all fun, just trying to be creative, whatever gets you across the lake, Um, and then I remember it was about 72 or 73 when I met Hausman. I was going up early in June, and we'd just gotten a little auxiliary motor for one of the canoes. So it was just easier to go back and forth and deliver supplies. And even as simple as that was, that made supplying and if you had an emergency, servicing.
Motor, you were lucky.
Smart. That's another word. Smart.
Wow. Steve, before you leave, having been involved for a good number of years, and you've stayed very involved with the program over the 50 years. I'm curious if you could just reflect back and share a little bit of how you feel like now, how has La Vida impacted? How did those early years impact you? Maybe a couple of the big lessons that you took away from 1970, 71, 72, and that you still apply to life today.
Well, one, I got the privilege of being Tuck's best man. That will live with me for a long time. You do get relationships.
Yeah.
And again, all the people, I know recently I've been more involved, and that's what you see from my years where just, I know what was going on, and that was about it.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest takeaway, because when I was doing La Vida, was that formative time. And I think it's that whole idea of servant leadership. That La Vida, that's how you ran it. That's how I thought about leadership. I later learned more. Robert Greenleaf was coming out with his book at that 1970. At the same time, all those pieces fell into place.
Yep.
So that probably is, to me, that influence that La Vida has on so many when you're out on the trail and whatever, learning how to care for one another. And oftentimes you can lead the patrol by being the last person in line.
Yeah, sure. Certainly, I'd affirm what Steve said about servant leadership. That was a big theme for all of us back in the day. Another thing occurs to me is that we were so entrepreneurial. This thing was just beginning to be shaped and formed. And so you experimented, trial by error, think outside the box, and you learn to do that. And I think maybe today is a new opportunity with COVID shaking everything up to begin to think in new ways, because old systems may not be practical at this point in time. So maybe back to the future for La Vida in that regard. And the other thing I would mention is just team building. Team building and stretching yourself. I had not grown up as an outdoorsman. All this was new to me. So I was learning as I went, and some of it was, not easy for me. And I didn't have a background in camping, and so I had to figure it out on the fly. I was assigned, and I was growing with the kids. So stretching yourself in that way and being willing to try new things.
How do you see La Vida still being relevant for kids, for high school kids, college students today, in what our world is?
Yeah, I think everything is screen learning these days. So experiential learning is so important. It just activates a whole different side of the brain. And there was a book written by Alvin Toffler back in, I don't know, the 70s or 80s about the future. And I remember one of the chapters, he talked about high touch and high tech. He said the more high tech we would become, the more we would need high touch in our lives. And that's what La Vida provides for kids, and it's so essential, I think, and so refreshing. And I think kids themselves are transformed when they have that experience.
Again, my name is Nate Hausman, Director of Outdoor Education with the La Vida Center, and I'm here with Eric Wilder, La Vida Advisory Council member, and former staff member. Eric's filled many roles throughout his tenure at Vida. He was a Sherpa. He's directed the adventure camp. He's been the director of the GORP program, which many of you might now know is the Adventure Pursuits program. He was the director of the base camp property for a number of years, actually the years when I was up there as a student. He is the hiker of a canoe up St. Regis Mountain, bushwhack extraordinaire. And the list could, it goes on and on. He's done a lot over his years, and we are so excited to be here with you this morning, Eric. Many people have been influenced and impacted by the base camp property. And as I prepared for this and have spent so many of my years up there, it was great to think back to the many memories that I have. I'm hoping our time together today could be both an opportunity to hear some fun stories. I know Eric's got lots of those, but also to continue just to marvel at how God has worked through this program over the years. So Eric, thanks again for being here. I would love if you could maybe briefly tell us a little bit more about how the search for base camp started.
Well, when I came back to Vida, some of those years, we actually had Vida was based at Gordon College, and then we just realized we were too far from the park, and the Adirondacks we felt like was the best wilderness area for us because you could still do loops. You could support numerous trips out there with less vans. And then we were able to live on Young Life property. They started that when I was in Young Life staff. And so Rich bought these mash tents and that we would set up every summer and run water from the Young Life boathouse on the back of Upper Saranac Lake all the way out to the base camp. So we did have cold water and we did have porta potties. And for a while they went unnoticed until the power company came and cut trees away from the power lines, and then it totally exposed it, and the neighbors were like, what in the world is this group of bohemians?
What would take us back to those first steps onto the property and what you remember of the various buildings and the place in general? What else do you remember from that first visit?
When we first got it, we just went up, Mark and I just went up. We put all the stoves on car jacks and wheeled them into the dining hall and out of the way. And then we laid down plywood. And then eventually early that summer, we laid down the linoleum that is still there to this day. Yeah, it's been pretty durable. But that first summer, when I turned on the water, it was all galvanized pipe that had rusted away. So water kept sprouting up. And so, but thankfully in the spring, the basement of the main cabin would always flood. There'd always be like 4 feet of water in the basement. So I just go down with a bucket and get a 5-gallon bucket to march over and flush our toilets with. And it was kind of nutty. And then, like I think you call it a little haystack. There was a hole in the roof when we first got there. And I think what happened is it got struck by lightning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because you see the hole in the roof, then you go to the fuse box, and all those little shotgun fuses were welded into the thing. But it was cleaning out cabins, and I was trying to be responsible. So we went into the trip food room, which used to be the office. That was our first office, and it was actually below. We actually raised the trip food room eventually. But there were coolers, old fridges that had food left in there, and the mice had just gotten in and chewed it. But all these cans from 10 years, 20 years ago, whatever. I mean, I'm like, well, let's recycle. So I had people opening up cans and dumping them out and rinsing them out. And I probably should have just thrown it all out. It would have been a whole lot quicker. We poured a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And, I remember I had one nightmare when all night long, I was just turning this one little nut and it just would never get tight. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that so explains my base camp experience when I was there.
It's funny you bring up a couple of very specific things, as they're the memories that stick out in my mind. I went on, my trip was May of 97. So that would have been a year later. And I remember we did the ropes course down here at Gordon.
Right.
And then we drove up and we camped at Owl's Head,
Yeah.
did our rocks, and then we headed right into the woods. So we didn't see the property until it was actually our last 2 nights were spent at the property, because I remember we were brought back early to do some service work. And I feel like all the May trip students were doing service work at that point. So that would have been the beginning of the second full summer up there.
Yeah.
And I remember my group, I think probably some other groups as well. I remember being down at the ropes course, and we were the ones cutting and laying the logs for the road, the corduroy for the road going into the ropes course. Doing celebration in the main cabin. That's what happened for me. And I remember it was a really cool evening, cool as in temperature wise, cool, and wet. And I just remember all the windows in the main cabin being very steamed up and all of us being back there.
My vision was to have celebration on that little hill, that little natural amphitheater as you're going out to some of the campsites. But I was given a celebration talk. I mean, we brought a generator out and an overhead projector, but we were doing celebration out there. And I just, after developing the whole bat protocol and things like that, and all I'm seeing is bats flying over kids' heads. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a Board of Health nightmare. So then we moved it into the dining hall for a little bit.
How many, let's see, here's a statistic question. How many squirrels do you think you caught over your years at base camp?
Oh my goodness. Well, at the old base camp, the mash tents, Chris Moody and I got one, and we actually put it on a leash and had it as a pet for a little bit. So we started collecting them, and we had one of those big soup pots, and we probably had, 20 in there. And Matt Loy was he was still maybe a freshman in high school at this point in time. I don't know. I don't remember how old he was, but he was going to paddle them out to the island out there in the middle of the pond. I thought if he had made it out the island with 20 squirrels, and even if they tried to swim across shore, it'd be like pike bait, the northern pike would come. And then he was loading them in the canoe. I think he tripped and fell, and the thing tipped over, and all of them kind of ran over him and stomped on him. It's like in spite. And yeah.
Well, if you think back to all your years spent at the base camp, directorship, bringing groups up, you've continued to bring groups up and go out on trips. As you think back to all those years now, can you share with us a few maybe moments or memories that really kind of stick out, that are in your mind of these are things that when you ponder about the base camp, there's a few memories that really you cling to?
I mean, the property is definitely a special place, well, I remember when I used to close it down by myself sometimes and just drain all the water lines and just go up, and a crisp September, October, just how quiet and peaceful and how brilliant the stars are, and just like, oh man, this is so great.
Thanks again for sharing, Eric. It's good to chat with you. And
it's good to chat with you.
For me, it's always fun to hear some of these early stories. So many people have questions about it. So appreciate you sharing a lot. I hope you enjoyed hearing more how God has provided for Vida over the last 50 years. Make sure to check your guidebook for our upcoming video releases and events throughout the weekend. We in the Vida office are so thankful you have decided to spend some time celebrating with us. See you later.